Immortal Blood. The moons and stars were hidden from sight, making that particular quiet night especially dark. The town guard had to carry torches to make their rounds, but the man who came to call at my chapel carried no light with him. I came to learn that Movarth Piquin could see in the dark almost as well as the light, an excellent talent considering his interests were exclusively nocturnal. One of my acolytes brought him to me, and from the look of him I at first thought he was in need of healing. He was pale to the point of opalescence, with a face that looked like it had once been very handsome before some unspeakable suffering. The dark circles under his eyes bespoke exhaustion, but the eyes themselves were alert, intense, almost insane. He quickly dismissed my notion that he himself was ill, though he did want to discuss a specific disease. Vampirism, he said, and then paused at my quizzical look. I was told that you were someone I should seek out for help understanding it. Who told you that? I asked, with a smile. Tessina Grey. I immediately remembered her, a brave, beautiful knight who had needed my assistance separating fact from fiction on the subject of the vampire. It had been 2 years, and I had never heard whether my advice had proved effective. You have spoken to her. How is her ladyship? I asked. Dead, Movarth replied coldly, and then, responding to my shock, he added to perhaps soften the blow. She said your advice was invaluable, at least for the one vampire. When I last talked to her, she was tracking another. It killed her. Then the advice I gave her was not enough, I sighed. Why do you think it would be enough for you? I was a teacher once myself, years ago, he said. Not in a university, a trainer in the Fighters Guild. But I know that if a student doesn't ask the right questions, the teacher cannot be responsible for his failure. I intend to ask you the right questions. And that he did. For hours he asked questions and I answered what I could, but he never volunteered any information about himself. He never smiled. He only studied me with those intense eyes of his, committing every word I said to memory. Finally, I turned the questioning around. You said you were a trainer at the Fighters Guild. Are you on an assignment for them? No, he said curtly, and finally I could detect some weariness in those feverish eyes of his. I would like to continue this tomorrow night, if I could. I need to get some sleep and absorb this. You sleep during the day, I smiled. To my surprise, he returned the smile, though it was more of a grimace. When tracking your prey, you adapt their habits. The next day, he did return with more questions, these ones very specific. He wanted to know about the vampires of Eastern Skyrim. I told him about the most powerful tribe, the Volkihar clan, paranoid and cruel, whose very breath could freeze their victims' blood in the veins. I explained to him how they lived beneath the ice of remote and haunted lakes, never venturing into the world of men except to feed. Movarth Piquin listened carefully and asked more questions into the night until at last he was ready to leave. I will not see you for a few days, he said, but I will return and tell you how helpful your information has been. True to his word, the man returned to my chapel shortly after midnight 4 days later. There was a fresh scar on his cheek, but he was smiling that grim but satisfied smile of his. "Your advice helped me very much," he said. "But you should know that the Volkihar have an additional ability you did not mention. They can reach through the ice of their lakes without breaking it. It was quite a nasty surprise, being grabbed from below without any warning." "How remarkable," I said with a laugh. "And terrifying. You're lucky you survived." "I don't believe in luck. I believe in knowledge and training. Your information helped me, and my skill at melee combat sealed the bloodsucker's fate. I've never believed in weaponry of any kind. Too many unknowns. Even the best swordsmith has created a flawed blade, but you know what your body is capable of. I know I can land 1,000 blows without losing my balance, provided I get the first strike." "The first strike?" I murmured. "So you must never be surprised." "That is why I came to you," said Movarth. "You know more than anyone alive about these monsters, in all their cursed varieties across the land. Now you must tell me about the vampires of northern Valenwood." I did as he asked, and once again his questions taxed my knowledge. There were many tribes to cover. The Bonsamu, who were indistinguishable from Bosmer except when seen by candlelight. The Kirilth, who could disintegrate into mist. The Yikif, who swallowed men whole. The dread Telboth, who preyed on children, eventually taking their place in the family, waiting patiently for years before murdering them all in their unnatural hunger. Once again he bade me farewell, promising to return in a few weeks, and once again he returned as he said, just after midnight. This time Movarth had no fresh scars, but he again had new information. "You were wrong about the Kirilth being unable to vaporize when pushed underwater," he said, patting my shoulder fondly. "Fortunately, they cannot travel far in their mist form, and I was able to track it down." "It must have surprised it fearfully. Your field knowledge is becoming impressive," I said. "I should have had an acolyte like you decades ago." "Now, tell me," he said, "of the vampires of Cyrodiil." I told him what I could. There was but one tribe in Cyrodiil, a powerful clan who had ousted all other competitors, much like the Imperials themselves had done. Their true name was unknown, lost in history, but they were experts at concealment. If they kept themselves well fed, they were indistinguishable from living persons. They were cultured, more civilized than the vampires of the provinces, preferring to feed on victims while they were asleep, unaware. "They will be difficult to surprise," Movarth frowned. "But I will seek one out and tell you what I learn, and then you will tell me of the vampires of High Rock, and Hammerfell, and elsewhere, and Black Marsh, and Morrowind, and the Somerset Isles, yes?" I nodded, knowing then that this was a man on an eternal quest. He wouldn't be satisfied with but the barest hint of how things were. He needed to know it all. He did not return for a month, and on the night that he did, I could see his frustration and despair, though there were no lights burning in my chapel. "I failed," he said, as I lit a candle. "You were right. I could not find a single one." I brought the light up to my face and smiled. He was surprised, even stunned by the pallor of my flesh, the dark hunger in my ageless eyes, and the teeth. Oh, yes, I think the thief definitely surprised the man who could not afford to be surprised. I haven't fed in 72 hours, I explained as I fell on him. He did not land the first blow, or the last. The locked room. Jana was precisely the kind of student her mentor Arth Camus despised, the professional amateur. He enjoyed all the criminal types who were his usual pupils at the stronghold, from the common burglar to the more sophisticated blackmailers, children and young people with strong career ambitions which the art and science of lockpicking could facilitate. They were always interested in simple solutions, the easy way, but people like Jana were always looking for exceptions, possibilities, exotica. For pragmatists like Arth Camus, it was intensely vexing. The Redguard maiden would spend hours in front of a lock, prodding at it with her wires and picks, flirting with the key pins and driver pins, exploring the hull with a sort of casual fascination that no delinquent possesses. Long after her fellow students had opened their test locks and moved on, Jana was still playing with hers. The fact that she always opened it eventually, no matter how advanced a lock it was, irked Arth Camus even further. "You are making things much too difficult," he would roar, boxing her ears. "Speed is of the essence, not merely technical know-how. I swear that if I put the key to the lock right in front of you, you'd still never get around to opening it." Jana would bear Arth Camus' abuse philosophically. She had, after all, paid him in advance. Speed was doubtless an important factor for the picker trying to get somewhere he wasn't supposed to go with the city guard on patrol behind him, but Jana knew it wouldn't apply to her. She merely wanted the knowledge. Arth Camus did everything he could think of to encourage Jana to move faster. She seemed to perversely thrive on his physical and verbal blows, spending more and more time on each lock, learning its idiosyncrasies and personality. Finally, he could bear it no longer. Very late one afternoon, after Jana had dawdled over a perfectly ordinary lock, he grabbed the girl by her ear and dragged her to a room in the stronghold far from the other students, an area they had always been forbidden to visit. The room was completely barren, except for one large crate in the center. There were no windows and no other door except for the one leading in. Arth Camus slammed his student against the crate and closed the door behind her. There was a distinct click of the lock. "This is the test for my advanced students," he laughed behind the door. "See if you can escape." Jana smiled and began her usual slow process of massaging the lock, gaining information. After a few minutes had gone by, she heard Arth Camus' voice again call out from behind the door. "Perhaps I should mention that this is a test of speed. You see the crate behind you. It contains a vampire ancient who has been locked in here for many months. It is absolutely ravenous. In a few minutes' time, the sun will have completely set, and if you have not opened the door, you will be nothing but a bloodless husk." Jana considered only for a moment whether Arth Camus was joking or not. She knew he was an evil, horrible man, but to resort to murder to teach his pupil. The moment she heard a rustling in the crate, any doubts she had were erased. Ignoring all her usual explorations, she jammed her wire into the lock, thrust the pegs against the pressure plate, and shoved open the door. Arthcamu stood in the hallway beyond, laughing cruelly. So, now you have learned the value of fast work. Yana fled from Arthcamu's stronghold, fighting back her tears. He was certain that she would never return to his tutelage, but he considered that he had taught her at last a very valuable lesson. When she did return the next morning, Arthcamu registered no surprise, but inside he was seething. "I'll be leaving shortly," she explained quietly. "But I believe I have developed a new type of lock, and I'd be grateful if you'd give me your opinion on it." Arthcamu shrugged and asked her to present her design. "I was wondering if I might use the vampire room and install the lock. I think it would be better if I demonstrated it." Arthcamu was dubious, but the prospect of the tiresome girl leaving at last put him in an excellent and even indulgent mood. He agreed to give her access to the room. For all morning and most of the afternoon, she worked near the slumbering vampire, removing the old lock and adding her new prototype. Finally, she asked her old master to take a look. He studied the lock with an expert eye and found little to be impressed with. "This is the first and only pick-proof lock," Yana explained. "The only way to open it is to have the right key." Arthcamu scoffed and let Yana close the door, shutting him in the room. The door clicked and he began to go to work. To his dismay, the lock was much more difficult than he thought it would be. He tried all his methods to force it and found that he had to resort to his hated student's method of careful and thorough exploration. "I need to leave now," called Yana from the other side of the door. "I'm going to bring the city guard to the stronghold. I know that it's against the rules, but I really think it's for the welfare of the villagers not to have a hungry vampire on the loose. It's getting dark, and even though you aren't able to unlock the door, the vampire might be less proud about using the key to escape. Remember when you said, if I put the key to the lock right in front of you, you'd still never get around to opening it?" "Wait!" Arthcamu yelled back. "I'll use the key. Where is it? You forgot to give it to me." But there was no reply, only the sound of footfall disappearing down the corridor beyond the door. Arthcamu began to work harder on the lock, but his hands were shaking with fear. With no windows, it was impossible to tell how late it was getting to be. Were minutes that were flying by, or hours? He only knew that the vampire ancient would know. The tools could not stand very much twisting and tapping from Arthcamu's hysterical hands. The wire snapped in the keyhole, just like a student. Arthcamu screamed and pounded on the door, but he knew that no one could possibly hear him. It was while sucking in his breath to scream again, he heard the distinct creak of the crate opening behind him. The vampire ancient regarded the master locksmith with insane, hungry eyes and flew at him in a frenzy. Before Arthcamu died, he saw it. On a chain that had been placed around the vampire's neck while it had been sleeping was a key. Incident in Necrom. "The situation simply is this," said Flaxith, his face as chiseled and resolute as any statue. "Everyone knows that the cemetery west of the city is haunted by some malevolent beings, and has been for many years now. The people have come to accept it. They bury their dead by daylight, and are away before Master and Secunda have risen and the evil comes forth. The only victims to fall prey to the devils within are the very stupid and the outsiders. It sounds like a natural solution to filtering out the undesirables then, laughed Nitra, a tall, middle-aged woman with cold eyes and thin lips. Where is the gold in saving them? From the temple. They're reopening a new monastery near the cemetery, and they needed the land cleansed of evil. They're offering a fortune, so I accepted the assignment with the caveat that I could assemble my own team to split the reward. That's why I have sought you each out. From what I've heard, you, Nitra, are the best bladesman in Morrowind. Nitra smiled her unpleasant best. And you, Osmic, are a renowned burglar, though never once imprisoned. The bald-pated young man stammered as if to refute the charges before grinning back. I'll get you in where you need to go, but then it's up to you to do what you need to do. I'm no combatter. Anything Nitra and I can't handle, I'm sure Masitha will prove her mettle, Flaxith said, turning to the fourth member of the party. She comes on very good references as a sorceress of great power and skill. Masitha was the picture of innocence, round-faced and wide-eyed. Nitra and Osmic looked at her uncertainly, particularly watching her fearful expressions as Flaxith described the nature of the creatures haunting the cemetery. It was obvious she had never faced any adversary other than man and Myr before. If she survived, they thought to themselves, it would be very surprising. As the foursome trudged towards the graveyard at dusk, they took the opportunity to quiz their new teammate. Vampires are filthy creatures, said Nitra. Disease-ridden, you know. They say off to the west they'll indiscriminately pass on their curse together with a number of other afflictions. They don't do that here so much, but still, you don't want to leave their wounds untreated. I take it you know something of the spells of restoration if one of us gets bit. I know a little, but I'm no healer, said Masitha meekly. More of a battle mage? Asked Osmic. I can do a little damage if I'm really close, but I'm not very good at that either. I'm more of an illusionist, technically. Nitra and Osmic looked at one another with naked concern as they reached the gates of the graveyard. There were moving shadows, stray specters among the wreck and ruins, crumbled paths stacked on top of crumbled paths. It wasn't a maze of a place. It could have been any dilapidated graveyard, but even without looking at the tombstones, it did have one very noticeable feature. Filling the horizon was the mausoleum of a minor Cyrodiilic official from the Second Era, slightly exotic, but still harmonizing with the Dunmer graves in a complementary style called decay. It's a surprisingly useful school, whispered Masitha defensively. You see, it's all concerned with Magicka's ability to alter the perception of objects without changing their physical compositions. Removing sensual data, for example, to cast darkness or remove sound or smell from the air. It can help by... A red-haired vampire woman leaped out of the shadows in front of them, knocking Flaxith on his back. Nitra quickly unsheathed her sword, but Masitha was faster. With a wave of her hand, the creature stopped, frozen, her jaw scant inches from Flaxith's throat. Flaxith pulled out his own blade and finished her off. That's illusion? Asked Osmic. Certainly, smiled Masitha. Nothing changed in the vampire's form, except its ability to move. Like I said, it's a very useful school. The four climbed up over the paths to the front gateway to the crypt. Osmic snapped the lock and disassembled the poison trap. The sorceress cast a wave of light down the dust-choked corridors, banishing the shadows and drawing the inhabitants out. Almost immediately, they were set on by a pair of vampires, howling and screaming in a frenzy of bloodlust. The battle was joined, so no sooner were the first two vampires felled than their reinforcements attacked. They were mighty warriors of uncanny strength and endurance, but Masitha's paralysis spell and the weaponry of Laxith and Nitra clove through their ranks. Even Osmic aided to battle. "They're crazy," gasped Masitha when the fight finally ended and she could catch her breath. "Quara, the most savage of the vampire bloodlines," said Flaxith. "We have to find and exterminate each and every one." Delving into the crypts, the group hounded out more of the creatures. Though they varied in appearance, each seemed to rely on their strength and claws for attacking, and the subtlety did not seem to be the style of any. When the entire mausoleum had been searched and every creature within destroyed, the four finally made their way to the surface. It was only an hour until sunrise. There was no frenzied scream or howl. Nothing rushed forwards towards them. The final attack, when it happened, was so unlike the others that the questers were taken utterly by surprise. The ancient creature waited until the four were almost out of the cemetery, talking amiably, making plans for spending their share of the reward. He judged carefully who would be the greatest threat, and then launched himself at the sorceress. Had Flaxith not turned his attention back from the gate, she would have been ripped to shreds before she had a chance to scream. The vampire knocked Masitha across a stone, its claws raking across her back, but stopped its assault in order to block a blow from Flaxith's sword. It accomplished this maneuver in its own brutal way by tearing the warrior's arm from its socket. Osmic and Nitra set on it, but they found themselves in a losing battle. Only when Masitha had pulled herself back up from behind the pile of rocks, weak and bleeding, that the fight turned. She cast a magical ball of flame at the creature, which so enraged it that it turned back to her. Nitra saw her opening and took it, beheading the vampire with a stroke of her sword. "So you know some spells of destruction, like you said," said Nitra. "And a few spells of healing too," she said weakly. "But I can't save Flaxith." The warrior died in the bloodied dust before them. The three were quiet as they traveled across the dawn-lit countryside back toward Necrom. Masitha felt a throb of pain on her back intensify as they walked, and then a gradual numbness like ice spread through her body. "I need to go to a healer and see if I have been diseased," she said as they reached the city. "Meet us at the Moth and Fire tomorrow morning," said Nitra. "We'll go to the temple and get our reward and split it there." 3 hours later, Osmic and Nitra sat in their room at the tavern, happily counting and recounting the gold marks. Split 3 ways, it was a very comfortable sum. "What if the healers can't do anything for Masitha?" smiled Osmic dreamily. "Some diseases can be insidious." "Did you hear something in the hall?" asked Nitra quickly, but when she looked, there was no one there. She returned, shutting the door behind her. "I'm sure Masitha will survive if she went straight to the healer, but we could leave tonight with the gold." "Let's have one last drink to our poor sorceress," said Osmic, leading Nitra out of the room towards the stairs down. Nitra laughed. "Those spells of illusion won't help her track us down, as useful as she keeps saying they are. Paralysis, light, silence. Not so good when you don't know where to look." They closed the door behind them. "Invisibility is another spell of illusion," said Masitha's disembodied voice. The gold on the table rose in the air and vanished from sight as she slipped it into her purse. The door again opened and closed, and all was silent until Osmic and Nitra returned a few minutes later.